Welcome everyone. My name is Eduardo Klin. I'm the Regional Director for HelpAge International. This is the first of 3 pieces consisting each of a vision casting, a webinar, and a briefing paper. These events are organized in collaboration with the Asia Development Bank, and this one with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. Today's event is on inequalities and old age. The second of these 3 pieces I'm mentioning will be on population aging and climate change, and the third one on population aging and communities for all. Let me now introduce the moderator and the panelists of this session. We have a deluxe moderator today, which is Mr. Kaveh Zahedi, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary for Sustainable Development of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. We commonly know it as ESCAP. Prior to ESCAP, Mr. Zahedi was the Regional Director for the UN Environment Program and has wide experience in different countries of the world: Kenya, Mexico, I have a list here, France, and Thailand. The main presentation, which will be done as the moderator will explain later, Mr. Zahedi, is David Bloom. He is a professor of economics and demography in the Department of Global Health and Population at the University of Harvard. He has written extensively about the links between health status, population dynamics, and economic growth. He's a prolific author. When asked how many books or articles he has written, and he mentioned more than 300, which is about 1 a day for 1 year. The discussants that we have today is Dr. Sanya Nishtar. She is the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Poverty Alleviation and the Social Safety Division. She is the founder of SAS, the government flagship social protection program, and leads in its implementation. She is also chairing the well-known Benazir Bhutto Income Support Program. Dr. Sanya has a long curriculum and will take us about an hour and a half of this webinar to mention all the positions that she has had. So, Dr. Sanya, I'll be short. I'll just mention that you were member of the UN Global Alliance on Poverty Eradication. You are now a member of that, and you were the former chair of the World Health Organization High-Level Commission on NCDs. And you have been, prior to this, you have been federal minister in the Pakistan government in 2013. Our second discussant is Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram. He's currently a research advisor of the Kasana Research Institute. And Jomo has been Assistant Secretary General of Economic Development at UNDESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and multiple, also long curriculum, honorary research coordinator of the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs, and has been former Assistant Director General of the FAO, and many other things. Jomo, I won't explain, like you were in the Commission of Experts of the President of the UN General Assembly on reforms of the International Monetary System. But now you will be talking about inequalities and old age. So this is a distinguished group that we have in this webinar. And may I now pass to Mr. Kaveh Zahedi, who will lead us through this session. Kaveh, the floor is yours, as you say in the UN.
Well, thank you so much, and a warm welcome to everyone to this webinar. It's delightful to have so many join us, whether from government, from academia, from research institutions, HelpAge network members, older persons organizations, older persons themselves, and of course colleagues from across the United Nations entities here in Asia Pacific and beyond. Today, the focus of our discussion is a very simple question. How can we reduce inequalities in later life as societies age? But as all of us know, this simple question does not have a simple answer, especially today, where the COVID-19 pandemic has in some ways, laid bare the region's fault lines in its development process. The pandemic has, of course, claimed lives. It's deprived people of their livelihoods, but it has not affected all people equally. Our region's inequalities, whether they are inequalities of disparities in terms of wealth, access to basic services, opportunities, these have all been magnified by the pandemic. Among those most affected, of course, are older persons, suffering not just the highest mortality rates, but also the greatest levels of isolation and most likely a loss of livelihood. In fact, recognizing this, the United Nations Secretary General issued a very specific policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on older persons and how to help mitigate some of the immediate impacts and set the course for a much more inclusive recovery. And the UN Secretary General's policy brief is really, we feel, a part of a clear momentum generated by the pandemic, the silver lining, if you wish, to recognize and address these long-standing inequalities across the world, but especially here in our region of Asia Pacific. The post-pandemic period presents an opportunity to build back better, including by reducing and eliminating some of the inequalities that have undermined our region's sustainable and inclusive development. Today, we're focusing on a part of this. We're focusing on inequalities in later life. These inequalities are typically, of course, built up throughout the lifetime and then exacerbated in later life. We know that the number of persons 65 years or older living in Asia Pacific are projected to double to almost 1 billion by 2050, from around 430 million today. So older persons will account for 18% of the total population in the region. And in some countries, more than 1/3 of the total population will be 65 years or older by that time. At the same time, income inequalities are getting intensified in later life because inequalities in access to social protection, job opportunities, even family support is what we're seeing. And sadly speaking, of course, the poorer older persons are, the more likely they will be living alone. And in many countries of Asia Pacific region, less than 10% of older persons receive any form of pension or even have savings. And it's not just on the side of the monetary side. Digital inequalities are becoming particularly evident, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, when digital services replaced so many in-person services. An additional dimension to all of this is the gender dimension. Women account for more than 60% of those 80 years or over. So the gender dimension of aging and inequality is becoming even more pronounced. Older women are more likely to be living alone, even less likely than men to have access to a contributing pension, and more likely to be living on lower levels of savings due to, in a way, a lifetime of inequality. So women typically depend on support from families, but when their families, again, are poor, they're also less likely to be able to support their older family members. So in a way, it's a circle of inequalities which reinforces itself. With that backdrop, what would we expect from our conversation today? Well, we hope to get a better understanding of what determines inequality in later life. And at the same time, we would like to share ideas on what needs to be done to reduce these inequalities among older persons in 2 dimensions in particular: healthy longevity and income security. And to get us to answer those questions, we have several distinguished speakers who will contribute to this webinar, as Eduardo has already presented. First, we will have a keynote presentation on the topic of population aging and economic polarization, followed by a panel discussion with our two distinguished panelists. We're also looking forward to a lively and interactive discussion with the help of all of those who are online with us. And allow me to remind you that you can type your questions and comments throughout the session in the question and answers box on your screens. And our team is going to be monitoring and collating the questions and reflections throughout the webinar for us to post back to the panelists. So, with that said, allow us to kickstart our discussions with a keynote video presentation by Dr. David Bloom. Eduardo has already introduced him. He is indeed the Professor of Economics and Demography in the Department of Global Health and Population at Harvard, and really an eminent expert on the topic, really the perfect person to get our conversation together going today. So with that said, allow me to hand over to colleagues. Let's have the video from Dr. Bloom. Of course, as is always the case, we confront technical difficulties at the outset of our session, but it's coming. Be patient with us, please.
Good day, everyone. I'm David Bloom, an economist and demographer at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm also faculty director of Harvard's NIH-funded program on the global demography of aging. I'm a principal investigator of LASI, the longitudinal aging study in India, and I'm a founding co-editor of Elsevier's Journal of the Economics of Aging. Along with my economist colleague, Madalena Farana, and my geriatrician colleague, Ben Seligman, I've prepared for this webinar a short background paper on population aging and economic polarization in Asia. The purpose of the paper and of this video teaser is to inform and stimulate participation in the webinar, to serve as a fire starter of sorts. I have three sets of preliminary comments that I'd like to convey. First, I'd like to apologize for my inability to share my remarks live. However, as you hear this recording, it's 3 a.m. at my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm hopefully enjoying a good night's sleep. Second, I'd like to thank HelpAge International's Eduardo Klein, Caitlin Littleton, and Peter Morrison. My co-authors and I appreciate their giving us this opportunity to share some ideas with you, as well as their thoughtful comments on the structure and content of our background paper. And third, I would offer my compliments to the organizers on their choice of topic for this webinar. Thus far, population aging appears to be the dominant demographic trend of the 21st century, and inequality appears to be the dominant social and economic issue. As prominent as these forces are globally, they're even more pronounced in Asia. And whether they're viewed through the lenses of ethics, human rights, political stability, or social and economic well-being, there's simply no hiding from the fact that population aging and inequality are core elements of human progress, both individually and in tandem. My objective for the next few minutes is to summarize my paper with Farana and Seligman. Briefly, it makes 4 points about the interplay of population aging and economic inequality among low and middle-income countries in Asia. Point A, population aging is a driver of measured economic inequality. This point follows from the fact that disparities between the old and young tend to contribute more to overall inequality as the population share of older individuals rises. It also follows from the fact that inequality tends to be higher among older age groups than among their younger counterparts, which is a reflection of early life inequalities in human capital accumulation, employment, and earnings that are magnified as people age. I would also note that inequality undermines the goal of healthy aging. Point B, measured income inequality is an imperfect indicator of true economic inequality. It's imperfect because it neglects the relatively large value that older people create for themselves and for their families and communities through the varied and significant productive non-market activities they undertake. I'm speaking here of the time they spend minding, educating, and socializing their grandchildren, the time they spend caring for others, and the time they spend working around their homes and doing volunteer work. It's not yet clear whether taking account of these non-monetized sources of productive activity would increase or decrease measured inequality. But the world needs to end its inattention to so many forms of economic contribution among the elderly, and to stop overlooking the consequences of those contributions for our understanding of trends and patterns in inequality under conditions of population aging. Point C. Older people's vulnerability to COVID-19 infection and to severe COVID disease, which is especially prominent among those who are less well off, is sharpening the association between population aging and economic inequality. This process is reinforced by a whole suite of now familiar social and economic policies designed to prevent and control COVID. Throughout Asia, these policies impinge disproportionately on older persons. It impinges on their ability and opportunities for employment, and it impinges on their food security and psychological well-being, especially in informal labor market settings and in the absence of strong social protection systems. Indeed, a recent World Bank report highlights the effect of COVID-19 on rates of extreme poverty, especially among vulnerable populations in South Asia, which indisputably includes large numbers of older adults. My last point, point D, is meant to convey a bit of good news. The good news is that we have plenty of options. We have at our fingertips a range of public and private health and non-health interventions that can disrupt the link between population aging and economic inequality. The health interventions include disease prevention, universal health coverage, and the implementation of innovative care models. The non-health interventions involve a range of social protection programs like pensions, insurance against unemployment and disability, and programs for reskilling and relocation. First-order interrupters of the contribution aging makes to poverty and inequality also include immigration policy, housing and urban design, and non-ageist policies and practices. Some of these interventions target the improvement of well-being among those who are currently older. Others target the improvement of well-being among the future old. But taken together, even a subset of these interventions can plausibly do much to appropriately acknowledge the past contributions of older people and also to enable their future contributions and to enhance the experience of aging. In so doing, they will also reduce the inequality-related burdens that will naturally accompany population aging in anything that even remotely resembles a business-as-usual future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Dr. Bloom for creating the backdrop, in a way, for our conversation today. As Eduardo mentioned at the beginning, this is a conversation that will not end with this webinar. It's really it's one that's in a way beginning with this webinar, and we hope to carry on not just with further reflections, but also some products that come out of our discussion. So please do make sure that you enter questions, comments, etc. in the Q&A box, as I mentioned before. So we would now like to reflect with our distinguished panelists on what was just said, on inequalities in later life in Asia Pacific, and reflect on the options that Dr. Bloom just mentioned in his video. After the discussions, of course, the panelists will then pick up on some of your questions as well. But first, it really is a great pleasure for me to turn to our two panelists in the order of speaking. First, Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Senior Advisor at Kazana Research Institute, former colleague of the United Nations, a senior colleague, seasoned in the issues of inequality that we will be discussing today. And he will be followed in the intervention by Dr. Sanya Nishtar, who, again, Eduardo has presented to you all, the Special Assistant on Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety of the Government of Pakistan, and of course, a leading expert in public health. So we are so lucky and delighted to have both of you to join us as speakers today. Jomo, if I may start with you. Maybe, this is a cascading conversation, talking about inequality, talking about inequality in later life, and then with the overlay of COVID. In a way, it really is a cascading conversation. Can you elaborate a little bit on what makes inequalities so persistent in our region, in the Asia Pacific region, and how has COVID contributed to it, to sharpening the link between aging and inequality, as Dr. Bloom put it as well? Jomo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kaveh, for this opportunity. Thank you also to the organizers, HelpAge, ASCAP, as well as the Asian Development Bank for this opportunity. Allow me to first emphasize that the appeal for universal health coverage has been broadly endorsed by health authorities in most countries. They have all signed on to the WHO's appeal for universal health coverage. And I think that is a very important step forward. However, having said that, unfortunately, many countries have not done very much to work towards trying to achieve this objective. Another major challenge, of course, is the balance between public health and private health. Because what we have seen, especially over the last 4 decades or so, is an increasing privatization of health services, which has often decimated and undermined existing public health services in very, very important ways. There has been a corresponding neglect as well as a privatization of what was traditionally considered to be the realm of public health. And this, for example, in terms of various types of services and so on and so forth, this has been a major problem. Now, as to what drives inequality, Asia actually is a very, very mixed region. In many countries in Asia, we find that the levels of income inequality or measured inequality, to use Bloom's term, is actually relatively low by international standards. Northeast Asia, for instance, sees the most common measure is the Gini coefficient, in income inequality in the range of about 0.3 or 30%. Having said that, however, I think it is very important for us to recognize that this is perhaps exceptional even within Asia. And what we have seen has been a decline of inequality, of inter-country inequality within Asia, precisely because parts of Asia, especially East, Southeast, and South Asia, have grown fairly rapidly, especially at the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century. This is in sharp contrast, unfortunately, to those in Africa, as well as in Latin America, where growth rates were much more modest. So there has been a general improvement. To put it another way, one could say that there has been a rising tide, but unfortunately, within this rising tide, we have seen a greater growth in inequality. The two big drivers of inequality in the world, of course, are China and India, both in Asia. And there we have seen fairly significant increases in income as well as other measures of inequality. This has not been mitigated, unfortunately, by the improved provision of healthcare facilities or greater attention to aging. A very major challenge, of course, has been the fact that with some improved well-being accompanying that rapid growth, we have seen life expectancy increasing. But whether this has translated into what you correctly term to be healthy longevity or healthy life expectancy is a different condition. We have seen, for example, in my own country, Malaysia, a very significant increase in unhealthy additional years of life, where the number of years of healthy life expectancy has actually grown by much less than the overall life expectancy. So these are some of the major concerns, it seems to me, which are important going into COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 has understandably drawn a lot of attention, partly because in many ways, COVID-19 is seen to be non-discriminatory in the sense that those who are exposed to the virus are not discriminated against on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, on the basis of all the other indicators. However, having said that, I think it would be accurate to say that the morbidity of older people tends to be much more greatly affected. And as a consequence of that, we find that mortality among older people has been significant. So if there's anything COVID-19 discriminates against, it is against older people. So this has drawn special attention and hence the timeliness of this particular meeting. Let me stop here so we can have a bigger discussion on these issues.
Thank you very much, Joma. I think that's you've said it all in a way. For a disease that is meant to be non-discriminatory, it has certainly exposed a lot of discrimination within our region, certainly, and in the elder population is one of those. Let's move on to our second panelist for this conversation, Dr. Nishtar. Dr. Nishtar, Jomo started with the issue of universal healthcare. This is very high. Once again, it's very high on our minds. Just yesterday, the UN Secretary General released his piece talking about the necessity of universal healthcare. We see developments in our region in Asia Pacific that seem to be a little bit contradictory. We have large inequalities in access to health, but on the whole, health indicators are improving in our region. How can this be explained, and does this help us in the sort of the appeal that is not new of moving our countries towards universal healthcare? Dr. Nishtar.
So, you made a blanket statement saying that health indicators are improving in our region, and of course, averages hide a number of different inequities. So that statement of yours, of course, stands true for a number of different indicators. But when you segregate, you look at health outcomes by regions, you segregate them by rural urban, you segregate them by gender, you segregate them for age, you segregate them across wealth quintiles, and the and the story might be different. The fact of the matter is that averages are brutal because they really take the spotlight away from the actual pictures. I recall the first time we looked at 13 indicators from the Demographic Health Survey of Pakistan. This was a couple of years ago. So we picked up 13 health indicators from the Demographic Health Survey, and we looked at how the outcomes fell in different wealth quintiles. And the illustration was, graphically, it was a beautiful illustration, but actually from a human perspective, it was so tragic, because for every indicator, whether it was access to skilled birth attendants, whether it was access to reproductive health services or immunization or blood pressure checks, whether it was the access level indicators or whether they were outcome level indicators, there were statistically significant differences across the various wealth quintile, and understandably, the poorer you were, the worse off you fared. And those inequities are not just at a across the income spectrum. I mean, sitting here in Pakistan, we are a very diverse federal polity, 4 provinces, 150 districts. There are some where the indicators are comparable to middle income, high middle income countries, but in others, it's a very different story. You look at the gender, I beg your pardon, the rural-urban differences in outcomes. So we tracked data in our social and living standards measurement surveys, which have been happening sequentially since the early 19s. And we tracked 3 indicators: access to clean water, access to sanitation, access to skilled birth attendants. And what we saw was that the trend was improving. So for each of these 3 indicators, the trend was improving both for rural and for urban, but the gap was not narrowing. So it was these 2 parallel lines that were moving upwards, but without the gap narrowing. And of course, then there are gender inequities across so many different health outcomes. So it's not just geographic and regional, it's also intra-district. Our largest cosmopolitan city of Karachi, population of 16 million. You look at maternal mortality in the urban upmarket areas, comparable to what you would see, for example, in the United Kingdom or Sweden. But then you look at the maternal mortality in the urban slum areas or in the rural areas, which are at a distance of 3 hours from Karachi. It's a completely different story. So you have to look at inequalities layer by layer by layer. And the policy prescriptions to address those inequalities are very, very different. But just let me connect a little bit with the topic of the discussion and the specific theme that you are focusing on. And by the way, I want to thank you for your leadership and for your focus in this area. And I want to thank HelpAge in particular. It's an NGO which has consistently raised the flag for the cause of the elderly, which is a flag which is not often raised. So let me connect briefly with the life course perspective of inequality. I think a lot of the problems that you see in that space are rooted in culture and context and societal values. And in our culture and in our society, the elderly are valued. So when you have your mother and your mother-in-law get into their 80s, you don't send them to old old people's homes, you look after them, and they are part of the societal construct of your household. And in fact, in the initial COVID days, as you know, we behaved very differently from many different countries. I mean, in the overall equation so far, Pakistan has done a lot better. And as a government, we'd like to believe that it's the efficiency of policies. But even in the earlier days when COVID was raging in many different countries, we were protected. And people would always ask us, what are the factors at play here? And one of the factors, of course, was demographics, because we have the population pyramid is very wide at the base. So above 65, we're looking at 4% of the population, which is a very different demographic profile than you have in Europe, for instance, or North America, for instance. So that was one factor. But then the other very important factor, and there are difficulties in empirically studying those determinants. One very important factor was that our elderly are shielded by the young and healthy in our homes. So my mother-in-law, who's in her mid-80s, lives at home, and she's shielded by people of different age groups. Our elderly do not live together in old people's homes, where infections basically are like throwing a match in a haystack, which is what happened in many Western developed nations. So coming back to the point about inequality and the differences in outcomes when you're looking at life course inequities, I just want to re-emphasize that a lot of the problem that you see there is rooted in how societies are structured, and how cultures play out. And in many Asian countries, specifically in our country, and I can certainly say, we have a very different way of dealing with the elderly, which of course explains many outcomes as well.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It does. I mean, context is in a way everything here. And really, I love what you said. Averages are brutal, because so much of the development of our region is hidden by those exact averages. The drive for essentially economic growth has papered over many cracks. Inequality is one of them, and aging is another. And now those two are brought together. So, Dr. Nishtar, I mean, you started to unpack this for us. You said, that you have to sort of unpack it layer by layer, group by group, target by target. In your view, as we turn our conversation to solutions, what are some of the sort of the policy options, the policy solutions that you see that are particularly effective? Obviously, the structure of societies influences them, but are there some policy directions that can be in a way proposed and rolled out across the countries, targeted at specific groups, that could help us move towards addressing the increasing inequality of older people?
Well, in terms of policy prescriptions, there are the standard policy prescriptions for the elderly, and I think that this is a whole science and an academic realm and a policy sphere, and those policy prescriptions are very well known. The question is how they're relevant in different environments and in different contexts, and what kind of weightage we need to give to those in different contexts. But I think the very urgent question now is, how should those policy prescriptions come into play as part of social protection strategies in a post-COVID world? Because one of the things that COVID has exacerbated in terms of problem is the loss of livelihoods. And the loss of livelihood means that, and I just want to go very granular, very basic, very grassroots. A breadwinner loses his job. He has to pawn valuables and fall back on his savings, depending on which socioeconomic rung that individual is in. In my country, there's a typical household of a breadwinner, wife of 3 children, and parents living with them. So what is going to be crowded out? Is the girl going to be pulled out of school? Is he going to cut corners when it comes to the father's diabetic medication? Or is he going to forego the laser surgery of the mother that is scheduled and for which he's been? I mean, there are some very brutal choices, and I hate to use this word again, but this is what COVID has brought upon us. I mean, there's a massive loss of livelihoods, very tough decisions that have to be made at home. On the one hand, breadwinners are very conscious of the need to put food on the table, send children to school, cater to the elderly parents. But there are choices that have to be made, and how these choices will play out and who will suffer, it's very difficult to measure these things. So this is a long-winded way of responding to your question, which was about policy action. And I, of course, strongly believe that this is the time for governments to bolster social protection. When COVID was raging in my country, our government took a very courageous decision to provide social protection to half the country's population. You know, we are the 5th largest country in the world in population terms. We provided social protection to half the country's population, and it was direly needed. That $1.25 billion that the government disbursed as cash transfers to 15 million families out of a total of 30 million was very well spent, and it was done in a very transparent and apolitical manner, and it really brought comfort to the millions of breadwinners who had lost their livelihoods, for whom life had come to a standstill suddenly. The question now is, how are you going to sustain this? And what level of social protection are you going to provide to families going forward? And those decisions have to be guided by evidence. So you need new poverty surveys, poverty prevalence surveys, new shock absorption, catastrophic expenditure estimates, new livelihood loss data. And that kind of base information will provide the evidence for the policy discourse that is ongoing currently, at least in my country, on the size and scale of social protection arrangements. We've already taken some decisions to expand. We've accelerated work on our National Socioeconomic Registry. We've made changes to the registry based on the COVID experience. We've taken a decision to make the registry more responsive and more shock responsive, more live, for lack of a better expression, so that people can go and raise their hand and ask for help. We've taken a decision to increase the number of shelter homes in the country, and these are the settings from which the elderly abandoned will significantly benefit. We've taken a decision to increase the number of soup kitchens. These decisions are already have been fast-tracked and are in deployment. So the cash transfers and relevant to the elderly, the shelter homes, the soup kitchens. We've taken a decision to increase the base of the cash for work interest-free loan program. So a significant amount of money is being put into that. We've also taken a decision to, even while COVID was raging, and we were I mean, we didn't have time to get our head above the water because we were rolling out our cash operations. We accelerated work to take our conditional cash transfer program on education nationwide, because part of the negative coping strategies that households have is to pull children out of school, and we knew COVID was something long term. The economic fallout is not going to go away in months, so we kept work. We didn't take our foot off the pedal, so that is being upscale nationwide. Even in the middle of COVID, we opened up our new health and nutrition conditional cash transfer centers, because stunting of children is such a huge issue, and part of the negative coping strategies of poor households is to cut back on food and nutritious diet, especially for girls. So we try to incentivize the uptake of the nutrition conditional cash transfer for girls by increasing the stipend for girls. So I'm trying to convey that the urgency of social protection from different vantage points for different target groups is the need of the day. Now in Pakistan, we are a bit privileged because back in 2019, we had conceptualized, rolled out a very large program called SAS, which had 140 poverty alleviation and social protection centered actions and policies, 140 focused on 14 different target groups, because we recognized that a laborer who comes to a city looking for work has a different requirement compared to a girl in a household who requires a scholarship for an undergrad, compared to a disabled who requires a stable stipend. So we tailored different interventions. We built further on what we had, but we structured a whole suite of new programs. We created a new ministry, allocated the largest ever social protection budget. We made critical investments in digital infrastructure, which helped us during COVID. We developed a governance observatory, a new governance and integrity policy. There were various pillars in addition to the programmatic elements targeting different groups. But then we had to, even while COVID was happening and we were rolling out cash, we had to fundamentally do a rethink of the strategy, of what elements we were going to scale up, what evidence we are going to play down, and what changes that are required. So we were in a bit of an advantaged position because we were not starting from a long way back. We were kind of halfway down a road on which we now need to go in any case. And I think that underpinned those investments in the digital infrastructure, the investments in the strategy, the readiness, also helped us to execute the cash program. There's still a long way to go. And as a government, we are very conscious that we are basically looking at 24 million breadwinners and their 160 million dependents who are in a precarious position because currently the lockdowns are on and off, and they are happening as we encounter hotspots. I went to my tailor the other day, who told me his business is not 10% of what it was. I mean, you go to the hairdresser and the hairdresser laments, we are not even at 5% of what we were. So we cannot assume that when you take when the lockdowns are off and we make the announcements that business goes back to usual, it is not. These things have a lasting impression on economies and on livelihoods. So it's a long-winded way of saying our ministry is the one that really shoulders a lot of burden. We are very conscious of that, and we're trying to do the best that we can.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, obviously a wealth of policies have been rolled out, but what really strikes me and struck me is you know, your opening words on this, the solutions are well known and have been advocated for so long. And so much of it is rooted in social protection, having better social protection. So COVID comes along and suddenly the fiscal space that was impossible, that didn't exist, suddenly opens up. We're seeing a new world of possibilities. So Jomo, I mean, in this context, has the pandemic opened up the space for solutions to inequality, especially for aging populations? And please address aging populations, otherwise Eduardo will fire me from being his moderator in the future. But have we seen a new space opened up that obviously, if it's built on existing investments, like in Pakistan, is easier? But do we see a new possibility for well-known solutions on social protection, universal healthcare, which will very directly affect in a positive way the inequality that we see in our aging populations?
Thank you very much, Kaveh. I think what we have, unfortunately, is a world which has become dominated by finance increasingly over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the consequence thereof is that finance ministers feel beholden not to upset credit rating agencies and their other partners in terms of overspending. I've been writing recently on a very venerable economist named Milton Friedman, whose own contribution to economic theory, known as monetarism, has been completely discredited, especially by the practice in the West and in the developed countries in the last dozen years or so of what are politely called unconventional monetary policies, where interest rates have been kept down very low and there has not been inflation. In fact, the recent period has been a period of very, very slow inflation. Slow growth, but also slow inflation. And so what we find is that the theory has been discredited, but nonetheless, too many people in the world, especially in the world of finance, are fighting these windmills of their mind, these windmills of the financial mind, and refusing to spend more. Now, thankfully, I'm not in the habit of praising the IMF's managing director, but Georgieva has been outstanding in calling for much braver spending in the face of the pandemic. And last week, I was very happy to note that the chief economist finally came along. Our chief economist of the World Bank, Carmen Reinert, had also echoed this kind of an appeal to spend much more. But whether or not finance ministers will respond accordingly remains to be seen. So I think the first thing is to overcome this kind of thing, this kind of restriction. But I'm also very concerned that there are so many things to be done right now. It is very difficult in the middle of a crisis where there are imagined to be so many fiscal constraints to embark on what needs to be done. I'm very afraid, for example, that the Sustainable Development Goals, universal health coverage, greater care for older people, and so on and so forth, will be very much forgotten in this context. Specifically, in this pandemic, I'm especially concerned about the fact that we have a situation where many governments, particularly in the West, were initially embarking on what is politely called herd immunity. Herd immunity basically means exposing everybody to the virus and then developing immunity among the population. It was only in mid-March when the Imperial College of London published its first study that the British government reversed its policy on trying to achieve herd immunity and basically took far more preventive measures. But the consequence of going for herd immunity has been to allow the crisis to grow to greater proportions. And what we see by contrast in East Asia, as well as in some other Asian countries, we have seen governments actually taking rapid, precautionary, preventive measures, which basically manage to contain the contagion. If we look at China, especially outside the 3 provinces around Wuhan city, when the pandemic hit, it had quickly spread to the 3 provinces, and there was stay in shelter lockdowns imposed in those 3 provinces. But beyond that, in the rest of China, there were no stay in shelter lockdowns imposed. Likewise in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, Vietnam has a very, very low mortality rate. Laos, the poorest country in Southeast Asia, has done reasonably well in this situation. The poor state of Kerala in Southwest India has done amazingly. And what is also very commendable about Kerala is that they've paid particular attention to the most precarious and most vulnerable sectors of their population, who include, of course, the elderly, but also include, of course, the self-employed and the daily rated workers and so on and so forth. So we need to do prevention. Yes, we shouldn't be only concerned about COVID-19, but it is necessary precisely because contagion is already running rampant for us to deal with COVID-19 in order to be able to have a population where we can do much more in terms of social protection, much more in terms of preventive health, and much more of the so-called non-health interventions which were referred to earlier. All this is absolutely necessary, but the biggest struggle we have in many of our societies is really getting our finance ministers to overcome the windmills of their mind, this imagine barriers to spending more. And once that is overcome, I think we will have bolder policies in many of our countries, and Asia should be leading in this regard, having done well in terms of containing the contagion earlier. It can do much, much more in terms of leading the way, in terms of reviving the economies. But this, as you hinted earlier, offers a huge opportunity as well. We are not going to return to the old normal, that's for sure. The question is, how do we move in a way that our economies, our societies move much more towards the sustainable development goals, including universal health coverage, including paying far more attention to the needs of the older people in our societies. And this remains a challenge. So there are opportunities, but it is precisely for that reason that we need to think about very cost-effective measures in terms of the kind of advocacy which we do in the short term, and also think about measures which are very appropriate for the medium term. Many of our economies, many people are going to be very, very adversely affected, and unless we take the necessary fiscal measures, not just monetary measures, we are not going to be able to rise to the challenge sufficiently, and there will be millions, tens of millions possibly, who are going to be very major casualties unless we contain the contagion as well as its other consequences, including, unfortunately, some of the policy consequences.
Oh, it's absolutely spot on. And Jomo, you know, one of the things you mentioned, you know, that this is not new. You know, we're talking to some degree about the consequences of decades of policies, decades of investment or lack of investment, or decades of choices that have been made, and they are in a way just being laid bare. And it's so important with as we think through the policies of older people, to think through policies over a lifetime. It's not an end of the pipeline. You're old and here it is, the magic policy that will somehow protect you and safeguard a healthy period in your life. And I think within that context, let's hear a little bit from what we call the voice of the older people, and reflections on life course and inequality that our colleagues at HelpAge have put together for us. While we do that, don't forget, if you have any reflections or any questions you'd like to pose to our two magnificent panelists, please use the Q&A box. But for now, let's listen to the video.
ไม่อายุ3 ขวบเนาะอายุ3 ขวบเป็นนิ้วแล้วก็ผ่านิ้วแล้วก็หุงยาแล้วก็เปิ้นฉีดยาแล้วมันถูกใส่เส้นใส่เอ็นหนึ่งขาเลยรีบตั้งแต่มันใหม่ๆนี่มันขนาดเนี้ยยิ่งใหญ่ขึ้นตลอดวันเดียวแย่นักลงไปมันเลยเดี๋ยวก็ไม่ได้ละการเอา
बचपन तो खैर क्योंकि गांव में तो वैसी गरीबी होती है और बहुत सारे मसले मसाइल का सामना रहता है। मेरे वालिद साहब फौज में थे, सिपाही थे, तो 65 की जंग वगैरह के बाद फिर वो जो है बीमार हुए, उनकी डेथ हो गई। तो जब वालिदैन की डेथ हुई तो मैं 1 साल का था, तो वालदा भी फौत हो गई। उसके बाद ज़िंदगी काफ़ी मुश्किल हो गई। घर तो ज़ाहिर है गाँव में कच्चे मकान होते हैं, पत्थरों से और मिट्टी से बने हुए वो घर होते हैं।
کار خونه میکردم، یعنی کار خونه که برای خودمون. من که مدرسه میرفتم کار خونه، ولی وقتی بزرگ شدم شوهر کرده بودم یه چند وقتی مؤسسه چیز مال سرطانی ها اونجا یه مدتی اونجا مجانی برای این کار میکردیم و چون وضعمون یه خورده خوب بود پول میدادیم اونجا و اینا زندگی به اونا کمک میکردیم.
ពេលជំទង់ខ្ញុំអាយុបាន16 ឆ្នាំនៅមួយគាត់ទៅមួយខែគាត់ឲ្យតែ100 រៀលនៅក្នុងមួយខែហើយងើបតាំងម៉ោង 3 ជូតក្តារផ្ទះយើងមិនដាំប្រើផ្ទះឈើនោះក្នុងឆ្នាំ 1962 នេះខ្ញុំអាយុបាន 18 ឆ្នាំហើយខ្ញុំក៏បានរៀបការជាមួយនឹងឈ្មោះសែមសឿនហើយប្តីខ្ញុំឆ្នាំ 1977 ដូចជាខែ 5 1977 की योता भाई जान
10 साल की उम्र से काम शुरू किया होगा। बस जो आम मेहनत मजदूरी होती है, क्योंकि एजुकेशन तो इतनी नहीं थी, ना ही इतने उस टाइम सोर्सेज थे, थोड़ा बहुत ही मिलता था क्योंकि वो वक्त भी ऐसा था कि ज़्यादा पैसे मिलते नहीं थे।
مریضی خودمه، ناراحتی خودمه. نه خوشبختانه بچه های خوبی دارم، نوه‌های خوبی دارم، خیلی مواظبم هستن، خیلی بهم میرسن. خودم مشکل دارم که یه خورده بیماری پا پیدا کردم که احتیاج به کمک و اینا دارم که الحمدلله اینا حامیم هستن و کمک هم
میکنن. Thí dụ như còn sức khỏe thì mình còn đi đây đi đó đi vân vân, nhưng mà sức khỏe nó bị hạn chế, cho nên mà cũng ảnh hưởng đến rất. Thì trong cái suy nghĩ cái hướng này là cũng muốn làm rất nhiều việc.
আমাদের ছোটখাটো একটা ফুলের ব্যবসা ছিল। এই করোনা ভাইরাসের জন্য গাড়ি চলেনি, গাড়ি না চলার কারণে ব্যবসা চালাতে পারিনি। আমাদের খুব সংসারে অসুবিধা। এবারে ডাক্তারও দেখাতে পারতেছি না, গ্রামে যে ডাক্তার ছিল ডাক্তার dekhate পারি।
Nung nag-60 na ako, medyo umatras na ako, sabi ko. Yung konting natanggap namin sa pensyon namin, saka yung bigay ng anak namin na pambili ng bigas o kaya ulam, ganoon. Tapos bayad naman sila sa mga ilaw, tubig.
បើសង្ឃឹមចៅគ្នានៅក្មេងទៅ14 ឆ្នាំនឹងធ្វើអីដល់អញ្ចឹង នឹងគ្នាអាចរលុយនឹងចំខ្ញុំវិញបានឬក៏អត់
नहीं ऐसा कोई नहीं था बस निज़ाम जिंदगी तो गुजरता रहा
ดีเลยโอ้ไม่ได้เก็บเรื่องหอมนะวะ
Thank you so much for that video, colleagues at HelpAge. It sort of, it really brings the conversation back down to earth again in terms of policy options. So let's launch into trying to address a few of the questions that we've been getting from colleagues who are listening in to us. I guess, and I'm going to try to sort of group them together. Dr. Nishtar, you know, you've spoken about a whole range of policies. Many of them are so integrated, they're not uniquely for older people. But could you maybe address some of the, especially on the health side, has any country got it right when it comes to universal healthcare? And a slight offshoot of that is with the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. Should there be some sort of prioritization for the vulnerable groups that you mentioned, especially for the elderly, especially given the cultural context that you so elegantly spoke about? Over to you first.
So two different questions on the question about vaccination and priority groups. I think there are scientific guidelines which are guiding us as to which the most vulnerable groups are, because I don't think the vaccine can be available for the entire world within a matter of, even when it gets the necessary regulatory approvals, it's going to be it's going to take years to vaccinate all those who will require it. So clearly those at highest risk will have to be prioritized. And in many contexts and in many societal settings, the elderly will have to be prioritized alongside health workers and many other high-risk groups. As I said earlier, how our societal fabric interplays to shield the elderly, and I'm talking particularly about my country, is something that has not been empirically studied. So to say that in Pakistan or in country X and Y, because the elderly live in homes predominantly, and by virtue of that they are shielded from the risk of COVID, would be an overstatement at this particular time, because this has not been empirically studied. But I guess we will have to wait for official guidelines from the World Health Organization on who is at risk and how the prioritization cascade has to evolve in line with availability. Your other question about has any country done it right? Has any country got it right with regard to universal health coverage? I mean, we can talk for hours about it. We could practically be on the webinar for the next one day. But my knee-jerk reaction to you is that you can't compare apples and oranges. So there are the Western developed countries that have small populations, that are resource rich, that have strong systems, that have fiscal space. Countries of Western Europe, countries of North America, Canada, certain countries in the Pacific, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And some of these countries have the traditional beverage style health system, free at the point of service delivery. UK is an example. The GCC countries are an example. The many Commonwealth countries, now well-developed Commonwealth countries, are examples of that in terms of their health systems base, which is the building block on which you construct the universal health coverage policy architecture. And many of these, the Nordics are the bastions. So some countries are in a very strong position, and repeating myself, it is the fiscal space and the population size that has determined that. Then you have other countries who built the universal health coverage edifice with many gaps based on the Bismarckian model. And many countries of Western Europe fall into that category. Bismarckian, but with many strands of public financing. The United States is a bit of an outlier because it has constructed its healthcare system on the Bismarckian model, but without the financing commitment that would guarantee universal health coverage. Over the last several decades, they've tried to patch and remedy that. Then there are other countries, and I would say many Latin American countries and the Eastern European countries who have followed on the Bismarckian lines and have used health insurance as the building block for universal health coverage. That has its own distortions. And then there are a whole host of other countries which I like to describe as mixed health systems, where you have rudiments of the public system, where the large interplay of the private system, where out-of-pocket payments predominant as a means of health financing. And if you recall, my last book was on this subject as well, the dilemma of the mixed health system, and the specific fixes, the specific policy fixes that are required for us to intervene with, with fusion funds, because there is an extent to which you can increase free at the point of service. Because of the high informality, you cannot use the Bismarckian model to the fullest. So you have to come in with a third tier health system steer. And in these kind of mixed health systems, it is disruptive solutions, technology-driven disruptive solutions, which are really needed to address inefficiencies and the pervasive rent seeking, which is now part of woven into the fabric of these health systems. So to wrap our heads around this, there's the Bismarckian model in its sizes and shapes. There's the Beveridge model in its various shades and hues, with a lot of overlap and interspersion of the private sector. And then there's the true mixed health system, and the policy prescriptions to deal with them are very different. I fundamentally believe that the universal health coverage recipe has to be very context driven. You have to look at the color and fabric of a country, and sometimes in countries as large as ours, where you have four countries rolled into one, in each health very decentralized in terms of decision making, in terms of structure, the solutions have to be very locally tailored. What are you going to do with free of point delivery? To what extent can you push insurance? Where will you bring a fund-based mechanism? And how are you going to use technology disruptively to address the pervasive problems that plague health systems at so many different levels? What are the limitations of health ministries today? Because today all the solutions in the healthcare space are being provided not by ministries of health. They're being provided by retail organizations that work completely out of the health sector. So it is Amazon that is going to bring you the pills in the future. It is the additive manufacturing sector which is going to determine whether you will be able to print your pills at a local pharmacy. It is the evolution of the developments in the digital payment system, which will determine if you will be able to pull a thread through all the disparate innovations that are happening in the health sector. Even today, technically, if you look at the different pieces of the digital developments in health, it is entirely possible for a woman to go to a kiosk in a remote African rural village and auscultate her own heart. The gadgets for that are available. Even today, it is possible to send an alert to a cloud somewhere up in the Amazon ecosystem. It is possible to send an alert if she has developed atrial fibrillation. It is possible to have her electronic records up there on the cloud. It is possible to send an alert to an Uber to pick her from her home and to book an appointment for her with a healthcare provider in the neighborhood. And it is possible for her prescription to be sent to her local pharmacy, for her pills to be printed there. It is possible for her insulin to be delivered at her doorstep through a drone. The technical and the individual solutions that I'm describing exist today in the commercial space, but we in the health sector are constrained in our ability to utilize them. And why? Because there has been no incentive to pull a thread through them. Now, who can provide pull a thread through them? Possibly digital payments. The solution to that is in the banking system. It doesn't lie in the health sector. It's a long-winded way of saying we have to play health with this completely new stack of cards. And it is not the usual suspects who come to the World Health Assembly who are going to be making this change. We need to have the ability to reimagine a future for healthcare and to draw on the competencies of all the health sectors. And I can tell you, all of them don't come to the World Health Assembly in May every year. So we need a fundamentally different construct. And of course, we can go into many other areas outlining how public health is being redefined in our time, you know, the role of not just digital and tech, but the role of food and beverage, you know, bordering on NCDs. But we really need to fundamentally rethink how public health will evolve post-COVID and how health systems will evolve post-COVID. This is a very important time for the global community. We need to sit back and rethink structures and systems and stakeholders and ways of engagement. So I look at COVID as an opportunity. Of course, it's a threat to millions and millions, but it is also an opportunity for us to recast the way we've been doing business.
Well, it must be, and as you say, I mean, as the questions came in, I think you've answered so many of them, because there were questions about whether sort of the privatization of healthcare is in some ways also responsible partially for inequality, especially of older people. So much is possible, but is it possible in a privatized environment? Others came in talking about essentially what we would call the digital divide, is the fact that so much is now available or could be available digitally. Again, another element of inequality, especially for older people who may not have the access or the know-how to access those same services. And you touched on so many of them and made it clear that, you know, that there are no simple and simplistic answers here, but we do need to recast the entire the way we deal with the health systems, and there's probably never been a better opportunity and a better case made than now with COVID. So I thank you for that. I think that's really quite extraordinary. Jomo, you know, we've talked a lot on the health side of things, but the economic side is also important. I mean, many of the questions coming in are about pension schemes and whether pension schemes are enough. Do they cover enough people? We have, you know, specifically questions on Pakistan, but it applies to all of our countries. You know, are enough older people covered by pensions, especially older women who may not have had the opportunity to contribute over a lifetime? And how do we overcome that? Social protection is a big word, but is that the silver bullet? Is it universal basic income that we should be talking about? You know, how do we address the economic side of the inequality of older people?
Thank you very much for those questions. If I may just quickly refer to the two questions which Dr. Nishtar responded to. I think it's very important for us to look at the comparative measurements in terms of cost to governments, as well as to outcomes. And Adam Wagstaff, who passed away recently, economist formerly with the World Bank, but also did work for the OECD and others, he basically demonstrated very, very clearly that the system which we associate with the United States and a few other economies, which is basically private health insurance, is the most inefficient in terms of cost effectiveness. A great deal of money is spent and the outcomes are nothing much to shout about. The social health insurance, which Dr. Nishtar referred to as the Bismarckian model, which really comes out of the German experience, but has been amended over time. The social health insurance is often offered, particularly by people coming out of American public health schools, as a desirable alternative. And of course, it is more desirable than the private health insurance. But what Wagstaff has shown in study after study after study is that budget-financed systems are the effective. Of course, that having said that, as Dr. Nishtar correctly pointed out, what does it mean, especially when you are dealing in most situations with mixed financing arrangements? And what does it mean? So design becomes extremely important, and design cannot be determined in the abstract, but has to be very context-specific and pragmatic. The other question which you posed, which is very important as well, is the whole question of vaccines. And we have the very unfortunate situation now where the multilateralism and multilateral cooperation has been at an all-time low in the post-war period. And we have seen how multilateral initiatives have been undermined very deliberately by various powers for their own purposes. And this has affected the whole question of vaccines and the availability of vaccines. We have already the Russians developing a vaccine, which they claim has followed the protocols which have been revised by the WHO in previous years. But I'm not an authority in this, and so I will not comment on this. But the question is that right now, anything coming out of Russia, possibly from China, from Cuba, is going to be rubbished, regardless of how effective they may well be. And this is the reality we live in the world. But related to that, and I think this is very important, because right now we are still in a contagion containment mode. Testing is so important. And we have, in the last few months, seen the advent of a number of new tests, which are not only cheaper, but faster and also very accurate. And this, I think, is a very, very major step forward. So as we are trying to deal with containing contagion, the availability of these tests, I think the Yale School of Public Health Pathology Department has made its tests publicly available. And any country can have its pharmaceutical department manufacturing that, because it is not intellectual property rights are weakly established. Some companies have, of course, already gotten into the act. India recently announced that they have developed a new paper test, and so on and so forth. I think we really need to ensure that testing ability is greatly enhanced, both in terms of costs, lowering the costs so that it becomes affordable to all, and raising the speed. I think one of the things President Trump said, which is quite correct, you can lower the numbers on infection simply by testing much less. So, but that's deluding ourselves. It's an ostrich approach. And this, of course, is a major problem. If I can go to your question on social protection, I think what is clear is that social protection ultimately has to be universal. Having said that social protection has to be universal, it doesn't mean it's an endorsement of universal basic income. It's not clear to me that all and ensuring universal coverage means everybody gets it in the form of money. We are living in a very money-metric world, and as we have discussed earlier in Bloom's paper, not everything can be measured in monetary terms, and we need to begin to think very seriously about many things which can be done by other means. In the Indian experience, for instance, rather than cash transfers, food transfers have actually been much more effective. Food transfers have been generally controlled by women, and this changes the dynamics of household power in ways which are enhancing the status of women in very important ways. But also, food distribution can be done in such a way as to ensure the enhancement of nutrition. We have too many problems which are self-inflicted. These are problems of micronutrient deficiencies, as well as diet-related non-communicable diseases, and we need to do far more about that. Malaysia is on the cusp of becoming a high-income country, but we have so many problems of malnutrition. We have so many people who are. The very easy and conspicuous thing is to focus on obesity and overweight. But there are a whole range of other problems which are less conspicuous. The number of people who are getting type 2 diabetes has gone up exponentially in so many parts of the world. We have so many problems relating to excessive consumption of sugar, as well as salt, and so on and so forth. Much more can be done in terms of improving the diets of everybody, including old people. And the nutrition needs of people over the life cycle change. When you're doing much more manual work, you obviously need much more calories, but most of the time you don't need much more calories. And if you're consuming too much more calories, it contributes to the enhancement of your blood sugar and a whole range of related problems. So I think we really need to have a much more comprehensive approach. And some of the things which Dr. Nishtar was alluding to, and Dr. Bloom earlier, are things which are very important part of the discussion. But I think simply thinking in money metric terms is not going to help us. I think we really need to think much more about human well-being in a much more comprehensive fashion. Thank you.
Very, very well said, Joman. And thank you, because you actually answered some of the other questions which were coming in about, fine, we deal with the health side, but what about the food insecurity side that older people are facing, for example? So I think you really nailed it once again. I think that's more or less brings us to the end of the time we have for the interaction with Dr. Nishtar and with Dr. Jomo for this panel. Eduardo, I'm not going to try to summarize an extraordinarily rich conversation. We were never going to, find the silver bullet solution, but I think we put so much on the table once again. And we can't get away from the fact that in the past, governments have not necessarily prioritized vulnerable groups, including the elderly. And that is just exposed by an experience like COVID. When investments are made, when systems are in place, for example, for the cash transfers, etc., that were mentioned for Pakistan, you can build on these, even in a situation like COVID. If the investments have been made over decades in health systems, they will bring dividends, even at the time of something like COVID. So I think, the message back to you, Eduardo, as I hand back is, we know so many of the solutions, but still the political will has not been there. And too many excuses have been in place, especially around fiscal space, etc. And maybe this pandemic has swept some of those away and gives us an opportunity, as Dr. Nishtar said, like we've maybe never had before, for really rethinking almost the entire system of protection. And of course, social protection and of the elderly has to be an integral part of that whole rethink. So Eduardo, with that, if I can hand back to you.
Thank you, Kaveh. You said it very nicely. I think this is an opportunity. We need to, as Dr. Nishtar was saying, we need to reimagine the health services, not only for older people, we need to reimagine the health system for everyone. We need to redesign societies in the sense that older people are protected, have the income they need, have the security they need. But not only older people, we need to think of societies that put human beings at the center. In the event, before just thanking all of you, I was impressed by one thing that Dr. Nishtar said, that in the determinants of inequality in old age, there is a large component of that depends on the social structures, the values, and the cultures that we have. But at the same time, we cannot lose perspective that inequalities in old age and in all ages are defined by the concentration, hyper-concentration of wealth that is happening in our countries, especially in Asia, but globally. It's not a world where 2 or 3% of the population have more health, more wealth, more income than 50 or 60% of the population is not sustainable. So when we redesign societies, we have to tackle both things with the framework of achieving equity and fairness. Having said that, I want to finalize thanking the co-hosts and once again saying that the next piece of work will be on population aging and climate change, which is another mega process of our age, our century. This event in particular has been co-organized by the Asia Development Bank with the support of the Japan Fund for Poverty Reduction and the Republic of Korea, East Asia, E-Asia, and the Knowledge Partnership Fund. And we also want to thank the SCAP for the not only the moderation, but all the collaboration in the organization of this event. And to finalize, there will be an evaluation sent to all participants, and we will be communicating with you and sharing with you not only the notes of this event, but also the briefing paper that will come out as part of the recommendations stemming of this event. Having said all that, I want to thank you, Kaveh, in particular, for this skillful moderation, Dr. Sanya, for your the input and the knowledge that you conveyed to us, and Jomo for your traditional, well-known sharpness in your comments. We thank you all and have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, everybody.
Challenging.